Do you guys remember when you were first kind of getting into leftist politics and what gave you that very first revelation of, wow dude, capitalism fucking sucks? For me, it was when I came across this old IWW comic. It's a comic conveying the basic premise for surplus extraction as a type of theft. That, in the wage relation, the capitalist pays a worker a wage and then comes out with a profit by selling the fruits of that worker's labour without having produced anything themselves. I'm sure we're all familiar with this by now though. It's a very popular argument that leftists make to try and spread class consciousness, i.e. getting workers to realise that the class relation and structure of the capitalist workplace is unjust, and that they should work to fight against the capitalist in class struggle to secure their own interests. It's so popular that the concept is explained in everything from decades-old IWW comics to YouTube videos today. One such example is a video by the Gravel Institute featuring Richard D. Wolff.
Meet Harold. Harold has a chain of buildings full of kitchens full of ingredients. But Harold doesn't know how to make a burger himself. He pays you because you know how to make really good burgers. Let's say Harold spent $1,000 buying all the ingredients in the restaurant. And after you worked for a few weeks there, turning the ingredients into burgers, they brought in $3,000. $1,000 of that is just making up for the cost of the ingredients. And if you were paid for the full value of your labor, you'd be making $2,000. But then Harold would only be breaking even on the burgers, and he needs to make a profit in order to survive. So Harold does not pay you for the full value of your labor. Maybe he pays you just $1,000 of the value you produced. Maybe he pays you $1,500. No matter what, you've been stolen from.
Another is a video by fellow leftist YouTuber Hakim, a Marxist-Leninist.
You go to work for, say, 8 hours a day. Out of those 8 hours, you produce, let's say, $80 of output. Your wage at the end of the day, though, is only $40. For 8 hours of work, you only got paid for 4. The other 4 hours you worked, you'll never see the fruit of.
It should speak even further to the popularity of this argument that such, relatively speaking, different groups of people like to make use of it. Of course, the motivations for each of them are different. The former will likely tell us that the solution to surplus extraction are worker co-ops, such that workers may own the fruits of their own labour, and the latter as justification for forceful seizure of the means of production. Lately though, I've come to realise that this line of argument or general approach to trying to strike at what's wrong with capitalism isn't actually that helpful to the left. I think when we really examine this argument, we begin to discover a number of problems, both in what issues it causes us to take with capitalism, and to what solutions in socialism it then guides us towards. And so today I hope I can convince you that there are much better rhetorical strategies at our disposal. The first problem with the argument is fairly straightforward in that it's just kind of wrong. Surplus extraction isn't actually theft, and the hoops that we have to jump through in order to justify that it is, handicap us if we insist on sticking to them. Let's overview the wage relation real quick, and I promise this won't take too long. A worker sells their labour power to a capitalist for a period of time at a predetermined wage which corresponds to the value of that labour power, i.e. its cost of production, which in this case is whatever covers the basic subsistence for the worker, or in first world countries where class struggle is more mature, luxuries on top of this subsistence too. The worker then expends labour power for the whole period of time to produce goods which the employer can then sell to cover the cost of production in raw materials and wages, as well as expand production and set aside profits for their own subsistence. It is of course this value produced past the point of recuperation of invested resources that is the surplus and what is usually identified as being stolen.
All profit is value extraction, and that means that all profit is theft from you.
But no actual theft has really occurred here, because the worker has been paid for what the value of their labour is worth. It's the exploitation of this labour power which yields the newfound value, and Marx makes this point in Capital.
If, therefore, the magnitude of value advanced in wages is not merely found again in the product, but is found there augmented by a surplus value, this is not because the seller has been defrauded, for he has really received the value of his commodity. It is due solely to the fact that this commodity has been used up by the buyer.
Remember that every commodity has a use value and an exchange value, and labour power is just as much a commodity as anything else. Its exchange value is expressed in wages, its use value in that it can be exploited as a resource to produce yet more value. It is this ability to produce value that the capitalist is paying for, as they haven't stolen anything. Of course, this point can come across as quite semantic. I kind of doubt that the knowledge of use value and exchange value will come as much comfort to a worker living in poverty while their employer runs off with bags upon bags of money their hard work provides. But this doesn't make it unimportant, as with the surplus argument's kernel of being strictly correct taken away, it forces us to lean on other reasons if we want to keep using it. One immediate objection might be that while no, in the abstract or perhaps idealized model of capitalist production, wage labor on its own doesn't constitute theft. What really gives it this character is external to the relation in the first place, that the worker must sell their labor power to a capitalist in order to survive. And this is a reasonable argument, and obviously regardless of your position on surplus value, any leftist should be vehemently opposed to any system which enforces mandatory labor, explicitly or otherwise. But in terms of justifying surplus extraction as theft, this still doesn't work out to be the best point to rely on. What happens if a worker actually doesn't have to work to survive? What if they live in a country with welfare, or even UBI? Does wage labour suddenly cease to be exploitative? We already see third worldists assert that because of the welfare state, and because workers in the first world are not, as it were, forced to enter the wage labour relation, they don't even count as real proletarians. I must ask those watching then, is this what we want? Do we want to live in a world where Jason Unruh is right? All this aside though, this isn't even the biggest issue. Maybe there would still be room for the surplus extraction argument for newer leftists if it didn't then condition them to view this feature of capitalism as the system's core deficiency, and naturally gravitate towards solutions which revolve around it. The video from the Gravel Institute doesn't delve into any specific solutions to the problem it lays out, but we already know what they, and especially Richard D. Wolff, already advocate: market socialism. That is, firms continue to compete in a market to produce goods for profits, but all of these firms act as worker cooperatives, where the democratic control of the workers replaces the single capitalist or board of directors altogether. And it's fairly obvious how surplus extraction leads someone to believe that this is an adequate solution. Workers are systematically stolen from to enrich the capitalist who employs them, and so we must rectify this by replacing their authority with worker democracy, such that we can own the full fruits of our own labour. But of course, as any Marxist knows, owning the fruits of your own labour does nothing to address capitalism's real problems, and that market socialism itself is simply a more radical form of social democracy, i.e. capitalism. It still maintains the profit motive and market forces influencing producers' decisions and encouraging ruthless competitiveness, usually at the expense of either the workers themselves or even wider society. We'll save a thorough critique of market socialism for another time, but put simply, even when controlled by a group of workers, one firm more ruthless in competition than another will always win out. And so the extent of worker control only goes so far as capital will allow it. Market socialism simply sees a switch in who's carrying out the exploitation of labour, from the capitalist to the workers themselves. Marxists should seek to do away with this exploitation altogether. But maybe this is unfair to the surplus value argument itself. We already know that the more SOCDEM types, like those over at the Gravel Institute, are naturally going to lean more towards these reform-orientated solutions. Perhaps, accompanied by a revolutionary lens, it becomes harder to manipulate this argument to serve these unsatisfying alternatives. Unfortunately though, when we look at the conclusions leftists like Hakim draw, it becomes apparent this is not the case.
Imagine if we had a different system. Imagine if instead of a class of net exploiters that exist parasitically off of the labor of working people, we had a society oriented towards the development of everyone equally. Instead of, like under capitalism, where you have no say in your work and have half or more of your surplus stolen, you have a democratic enterprise, one in which you and all your fellow coworkers democratically decide how and what to produce, where you divide your work as output that goes to you for your needs and personal development, and output that goes to a direct social fund.
The solution presented to us by Hakim is the typical Marxist-Leninist position for a centrally planned economy through which workers own the means of production through the state, as it were, and have the surplus of their labour utilised for the collective good, rather than the profit of private individuals. That is, investing it into welfare programs and public infrastructure. The problem here then is that as much attention is paid to the way in which we carry out production as in the market socialist case. Again, the problem is framed as one of distribution, not production. The idea is that to solve the problem of surplus theft, we must simply rectify where that surplus goes, either to the hands of the direct producers like in market socialism, or to a workers' state. This is encapsulated by Hakim not even challenging the idea of an 8-hour workday.
Instead of working 4 hours for yourself and 4 hours for a capitalist, everyone would work 4 hours for themselves and 4 hours for social development.
What Marxism should strike at is this very generation of surplus value to begin with, shrinking the working day down to its absolute minimum, coupled with dissolving the distinction between work and leisure altogether, i.e. abolishing capital and freeing ourselves from it in the process, not merely moving around the fruits of its expansion. The USSR could never go this far in liberating labour due to the continually pressing need to expand its own capital to compete with the external world. And let's not forget the fascists next door. And with this expansion of capital, even if not for private gain but the interests of the workers' state, all the hallmarks of wage labour under traditional capitalism are preserved. The production of surplus value can only come with the coercion to work, either through the threat of starvation or, in the case of the USSR, the explicit approach of mandatory employment. Social relations continue to be mediated through commodities. People are not people, but rather their roles within the division of labour. And daily, we must trade in time from our own lives in exchange for our own subsistence. Only now, rather than coerced by market forces, we are forced through legal apparatus to fulfill the exact same motions and serve the exact same purpose, the expansion of capital. Whether or not you want to say this is better or worse than traditional, market-based capitalism is besides the point, because as Marxists we should be concerned with the fundamental aspects of the mode of production, not the mode of distribution. As far as the USSR goes specifically, there is a compelling case to be made that it had to take on the role of the mediator of capital in order to both industrialize and compete with the outside world, although only in the same fashion of how the private capitalist must expand their own capital to compete with their peers at the market. Here then, we should see the USSR as a tragedy to be learned from, an aspiration to socialism that could never meaningfully break with the logic of capital, not a shining example of an ideal alternative to show new and learning leftists, as is done here by Hakim. It should be clear by now then that focusing on the extraction of surplus value leaves much more to capitalism unchallenged, and allows for supposed solutions which leave the worst of capitalism very much intact. At the end of the day, what Marxists need to be rallying around, what we inscribe on our banners and spearhead our rhetoric with, is simple: freedom. Freedom from work, freedom from capital, and above all else, free time. Communism is not the abolition of physical labour, but the transformation from work as an alienating activity, one in service to capital, back into one in which the collective process of labour generates an authentic sense of community and solidarity to serve creativity and fulfilment of the labourers themselves. The surplus value argument does nothing to even begin to convey these goals, and as we can see, often diverts us away from them instead. But of course, this is still all under the context of rhetoric. What we want to give to those new or teetering leftists to make it click as to why capitalism has to go. You might be apprehensive about opening with such abstract ideas, and that maybe, if nothing else, the surplus argument can help get new leftists in on the cause, only later learning the correct way of how to think about things. Setting aside though that taking positions we know to be flawed for broader appeal is the definition of opportunism, a tactic history has routinely shown is best to be avoided, I don't think we have to make a choice between rhetorical effectiveness and being correct here either. In fact, I'd argue that the ideas I've laid out here have the potential to be even more effective than the idea of surplus value ever could be. When we boil them down and take away all the fancy vocabulary dressing, it's actually a really simple idea. We're just arguing for free time and happiness. We want to go to people and say, hey, you know capitalism makes you work way longer than society requires and forces you to do it in a way that robs you of fundamental social experiences that previous generations took for granted? Community, creativity, and a sense of ownership over your own labour? Yes, we can make current conditions nicer by joining unions, voting in soc dems, and improving working conditions, but we could never strike at the core of what capitalism takes away from you. Not only the raw amount of time that goes into capitalist production, but what do you get out of that spent time in the first place, which under capitalism is always alienated to the point of effectively nothing. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just do away with the whole thing altogether? This is what I want to bring in new leftists with. A strong sense of why we're really fighting for communism, not a half measure which we tell ourselves we can correct them on later when they're quote ready to hear it. I have have no reason to believe that we can't radicalize just as many, if not more, new leftists with this line of argument instead, and then with the added benefit of setting them up to understand the fundamental aspects of communism later on. Of course, none of this means we have to drop the idea of surplus value extraction altogether. There's a reason Marx talks about it in his own introductory works. It still very much has a place in our analysis of capitalism and wage labour, as the source of profit and the nature of how labour power as a natural resource is exploited to generate that profit. I just don't think it has a place anymore as the outgoing central premise and justification for overthrowing capitalism. Rather, I think the topics of free time and social alienation are far more ripe for hitting capitalism at its core and appealing to people far more effectively. And after this video, I hope you do too.